The night of June 22, 1314, descended upon the woodlands south of Stirling Castle, with an oppressive stillness that seemed to hold its breath before the storm. Through the ancient oaks of the new park, shadows moved in disciplined silence, men who had marched from the farthest reaches of Scotland, from islands whose names were whispered in Gaelic, from glens where English soldiers dared not venture, from coastlines battered by northern seas. They came in answer to a summons that had traveled through secret channels, carried by messengers who rode at night and spoke only to chieftains sworn to an allegiance that transcended clan rivalries stretching back generations. Robert the Bruce stood at the edge of the encampment, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. 7 years of guerrilla warfare had carved deep lines into his face, yet his posture remained unbowed despite the weight of excommunication that hung upon him like an invisible chain. The Pope in Avignon had condemned him. The Church had turned its face from Scotland. And yet in this moment, with an English army of unprecedented size approaching from the south, Bruce commanded the loyalty of warriors who had once sworn blood oaths against each other. The Highland chiefs gathered in the shadows of a makeshift council, men whose grandfathers had raided each other's cattle, whose clans had feuded over land and honor for centuries. William, Earl of Sutherland, stood beside Angus Og MacDonald, Lord of the Isles, whose very presence represented a political miracle. The MacDonalds commanded territories vast enough to rival kingdoms, their galleys controlling sea routes that connected Scotland's Western Isles to Ireland and beyond. Beside them stood Malcolm Drummond, whose family had navigated the treacherous waters between Scottish and English allegiance, and the chief of Clan Grant, whose warriors had descended from mountain strongholds that had never known English rule. They had come because of what Bruce had offered them, not merely freedom from English domination, but something more profound. In the months before this gathering, emissaries had moved through the Highlands carrying a message that transcended politics, that Scotland itself hung in the balance, that if Stirling Castle fell and Bruce's forces were destroyed, the English would sweep through the glens with a vengeance that would erase clan identities forever. The choice was stark: unite under Bruce or face extinction under Edward's successors. But there was something else, something whispered only among the most trusted advisors. Runners from the coast had brought word of ships arriving in darkness, of men who wore no colors but carried themselves with the discipline of warrior monks. Some claimed to have seen white mantles folded and hidden in saddlebags, crosses painted over but still faintly visible beneath fresh dye. The Knights Templar had been destroyed by the French king 7 years ago, their order dissolved by papal decree, their Grand Master burned at the stake in Paris. Yet rumors persisted that some had escaped, that treasure ships had sailed from La Rochelle, bearing not just gold but battle-hardened knights who had nowhere else to turn. Bruce neither confirmed nor denied these whispers. He simply reminded his chiefs that Scotland lay outside the Pope's effective authority, that an excommunicated king could harbor fugitives from papal persecution without fear, and that the battle they would fight at dawn would require every skilled warrior they could muster. The schiltrons, dense formations of spearmen that had become Scotland's answer to English cavalry, were positioned across the Roman road leading to Stirling. Hidden pits had been dug across the approaches, filled with sharpened stakes and covered with brush. Caltrops, four-pointed iron spikes designed to cripple horses, lay scattered across the ground like deadly seeds. As midnight approached, Maurice the abbot of Incheffray moved among the warriors, his blind eyes seeing nothing, yet his presence bringing comfort to men who might not survive the dawn. The Highlanders knelt in the darkness, their prayers rising like smoke toward a heaven that seemed to have abandoned them. Yet still they prayed. And in that moment, whatever differences had divided them, clan against clan, lowlander against Highlander, Catholic against excommunicate, were subsumed into a single terrible unity forged in the shadow of annihilation. Tomorrow would reveal whether their secret alliance could withstand the greatest army England had ever assembled. Tomorrow would determine if the mystery of their coordination, the sudden appearance of warriors whose origin no chronicle would record, would be enough to turn the tide. Tomorrow, at Bannockburn, history would be written by those who survived, or erased by those who conquered. To understand the unprecedented nature of what occurred at Bannockburn, one must first comprehend the fractured landscape of Scottish politics in the decades preceding 1314. The death of King Alexander III in 1286, followed by the death of his granddaughter Margaret the Maid of Norway in 1290, had left Scotland without a clear heir and vulnerable to English manipulation. Edward III of England, seeing opportunity in chaos, had maneuvered to place John Balliol on the Scottish throne, expecting a puppet he could control. When Balliol proved insufficiently compliant, Edward invaded, deposed him, and began the systematic conquest that would earn him the title Hammer of the Scots. The Scottish resistance that coalesced around William Wallace in the 1290s had been heroic, but ultimately doomed. Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge in 1297 demonstrated that Scottish tactical innovation could defeat English conventional warfare, but his subsequent defeat at Falkirk in 1298 revealed the limits of inspiration without resources. Wallace's execution in 1305, castrated, disemboweled, and quartered in London, was meant to serve as a final warning against Scottish defiance. Instead, it created a martyr whose memory would fuel rebellion for generations. Robert Bruce's claim to the Scottish throne was complicated and contested. His family had actually sided with Edward I during certain phases of the conflict, and his murder of John Comyn before the altar at Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries in 1306 had fractured whatever unity existed among Scottish nobility. The Comyns had been rivals to the Bruce family for decades, and Robert's act of sacrilege, killing a man in a church, resulted in his excommunication by Pope Clement V. This excommunication would prove to be both Bruce's greatest vulnerability and, paradoxically, his greatest freedom. The Highland clans represented a force that previous Scottish leaders had struggled to unify. The clan system operated according to ancient principles of kinship and honor that transcended feudal obligations to distant kings. Chiefs commanded absolute loyalty from their warriors, but those same chiefs were locked in generational feuds with neighboring clans over territory, cattle, and blood debts. The MacDonalds and the MacDougals had been mortal enemies. The Campbells and the MacGregors viewed each other with mutual suspicion. The concept of these clans coordinating their military efforts under a single commander was, to contemporary observers, nearly inconceivable. Yet between 1306 and 1314, something remarkable occurred. Historical records from this period show curious gaps and contradictions. Chronicles that should have documented clan movements fall silent. Messengers traveled between territories that had no previous diplomatic contact. Chiefs who had sworn oaths of enmity appeared together at locations never formally recorded. Modern analysis of surviving documents reveals a pattern of deliberate obscurity, as if participants were consciously avoiding creating evidence of their coordination. One particularly intriguing document, discovered in the archives of a Highland monastery in the 19th century, describes a gathering that took place in the winter of 1313. The text is fragmentary, portions deliberately burned or water damaged beyond recovery. But what remains describes chiefs from at least 7 major clans meeting in secret at an unspecified location in the Western Highlands. The meeting was apparently facilitated by intermediaries whose identity is obscured through cryptic references to the brothers who have no home and warriors seeking sanctuary from Rome's judgment. The timing of this gathering is significant. By late 1313, Edward II of England had issued his ultimatum regarding Stirling Castle. The fortress would be relieved by English forces by midsummer 1314 or surrendered to the Scots. This gave Bruce nearly 6 months to prepare for a confrontation he knew would be decisive. The Highland chiefs, according to the fragmentary account, agreed to set aside their feuds for the duration of the crisis, but their agreement apparently included conditions that were never recorded in any official chronicle. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Highlands dating to this period reveals unusual patterns. Hordes of weapons have been discovered buried near former clan territories in quantities suggesting systematic collection and redistribution. Routes through mountain passes show signs of sudden heavy use followed by attempts to obscure the trails. Graves from this era, particularly in areas associated with Templar properties established in the 12th century, contain warriors buried with honors suggesting high status, but without identifying markers, swords and armor but no clan symbols, no names, no heraldic devices. The political landscape of 1314 Europe adds another layer to the mystery. The Knights Templar had been destroyed by King Philip IV of France beginning in October 1307. Their wealth seized, their members arrested, tortured, and executed. By 1312, Pope Clement V had officially dissolved the order. Yet the Templar fleet based at La Rochelle vanished days before the arrests, and testimony from Templar trials mentions 18 galleys departing with the treasury to unknown destinations. Portugal welcomed Templar refugees, reconstituting them as the Order of Christ. But Scotland, excommunicated and outside effective papal control, would have been equally attractive to fugitive warrior monks with nowhere else to turn. The convergence of these factors, clan unification, Templar dissolution, Bruce's excommunication, and the English threat, created a moment of historical possibility that should have been impossible. The mystery lies not in whether these elements existed independently, but in how they came together in a coordinated strategy that left almost no documentary trail. Someone orchestrated this alliance. Someone possessed the diplomatic skill, the strategic vision, and the resources to unite forces that should have remained perpetually divided. And someone ensured that the evidence of this coordination would be obscured, perhaps deliberately, so that future generations would debate whether it had ever happened at all. The first breakthrough in understanding the true nature of the Bannockburn alliance came not from a battlefield excavation, but from a sealed chamber discovered during restoration work on a medieval chapel in Midlothian in 1987. Workers renovating the foundation of a structure known locally as Temple, a name that itself spoke of centuries-old connections to the Knights Templar, uncovered a stone compartment that had been deliberately hidden behind later masonry work. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather that had somehow preserved them through 7 centuries of Scottish weather, were parchment documents written in a mixture of Latin, Scots Gaelic, and what specialists eventually identified as a cipher system used by military religious orders in the early 14th century. The documents, once carefully unfolded and subjected to modern conservation techniques, revealed fragments of what appeared to be coordination orders. Names of Highland chiefs were listed alongside dates corresponding to late 1313 and early 1314. Routes were described using terrain features rather than place names, a technique designed to obscure locations if the messages were intercepted. Most intriguingly, several passages referred to the external brothers who would stand in reserve and reveal themselves only at the moment of necessity. The cipher, when partially decoded by specialists in medieval cryptography, contained references to ships arriving on the west coast and warriors who carried no banner but served the cause of freedom from tyranny, both spiritual and temporal. A decade later, ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted at sites across southern Scotland as part of a broader archaeological mapping project revealed anomalous patterns beneath locations associated with the 1314 campaign. At multiple sites along routes between Highland territories and Stirling, researchers identified what appeared to be the remains of temporary encampments far larger than would have been expected for routine travel. The density of metal artifacts detected beneath the soil, fragments of weapons, armor fittings, and horse tack, suggested coordinated movements of substantial armed forces through areas previously thought to have been sparsely inhabited borderlands. Most dramatically, excavations near the modern town of Temple in the early 2000s uncovered a burial site containing the remains of at least 30 individuals interred with military honors, but without identification. Carbon dating placed the burials between 1310 and 1320, precisely the period of the Scottish Wars of Independence. The weapons buried with the dead, swords, daggers, and fragments of chainmail, showed craftsmanship consistent with continental European manufacture, particularly from regions associated with French and German metalworking traditions. Several of the swords bore marks that specialists identified as consistent with those found on weapons documented in Templar armories before the Order's dissolution. Analysis of the skeletal remains revealed individuals who had experienced the physical stresses associated with extensive combat training and mounted warfare. Several showed healed fractures characteristic of cavalry engagements. Isotopic analysis of tooth enamel, which records geographic origins through chemical signatures in groundwater, indicated that at least half the individuals had spent their childhoods in regions of France and the Holy Land. They had come to Scotland as adults and been buried with honors in a location that bore the name of the very order to which they may have belonged. In 2015, researchers examining medieval tax records from the Scottish Exchequer made an unexpected discovery. For the years 1313 and 1314, there existed unusual gaps in property assessments for territories in the Western Highlands. Properties that should have generated revenue showed no recorded income, yet later records confirmed these same properties had remained productive. The pattern suggested either incomplete record-keeping, unlikely given the meticulous nature of medieval financial documentation, or deliberate omission of information that authorities wished to keep obscure. Cross-referencing these gaps with clan territories revealed they corresponded precisely to regions from which Highland warriors would have been drawn for the Bannockburn campaign. Contemporary English chronicles provided an unexpected corroboration of something unusual occurring at Bannockburn. While Scottish sources tended to attribute Bruce's victory to divine favor and tactical brilliance, English accounts struggled to explain how an outnumbered army had achieved such a decisive triumph. Multiple English chroniclers mentioned a mysterious force appearing at a critical moment in the battle, describing them variously as fresh troops from an unknown quarter, warriors in white, and knights whose origin could not be determined. These descriptions, written independently by chroniclers who had no apparent reason to fabricate such details, suggested the presence of a disciplined cavalry force that did not fit the expected composition of Bruce's predominantly infantry army. Modern military historians analyzing the tactical execution at Bannockburn have noted elements that seem inconsistent with typical Scottish warfare of the period. The coordination between different divisions of Bruce's army, the precise timing of movements, and particularly the deployment of the cavalry force commanded by Sir Robert Keith, demonstrate a level of professional military planning more characteristic of continental European warfare than Highland clan tactics. The schiltrons, dense formations of spearmen, were a Scottish innovation, but their deployment at Bannockburn showed refinements suggesting input from individuals with experience in complex battlefield coordination. Perhaps most intriguingly, analysis of place names and local traditions in areas where Bruce's army assembled revealed persistent oral histories about the foreign knights who came to help the Bruce and the white warriors who appeared from the mist. These traditions, recorded by folklorists in the 19th century before the full scope of Templar history was widely known, described events remarkably consistent with the presence of fugitive Templar knights. The stories were specific enough to include details about ships arriving at remote western harbors, about knights who spoke French and Latin but learned Gaelic, about warriors who attended Catholic Mass despite being technically excommunicated along with Bruce himself. The cumulative weight of this evidence, documents, archaeological findings, skeletal analysis, historical gaps, and persistent oral traditions, presented a picture far more complex than the traditional narrative of Bannockburn as simply a triumph of Scottish national unity. Something had brought together forces that should have remained separate, coordinated movements that should have been impossible, and introduced military capabilities that Bruce's army should not have possessed. The mystery was not whether these elements existed. Modern research had confirmed they did, but how they had been orchestrated, by whom, and under what conditions of such profound secrecy that even 7 centuries later, substantial evidence remained hidden or deliberately obscured. The task of reconstructing the months between autumn 1313 and June 1314 requires assembling fragments from sources that were never meant to be connected. Scottish royal records from this period are notably sparse, with entire sequences of dates showing no official business, despite this being a critical period of military preparation. English administrative documents, normally meticulous in tracking Scottish movements across the border, show unusual gaps in intelligence gathering from the Western Highlands. Medieval chroniclers who documented other aspects of the Scottish wars in exhaustive detail become curiously vague when describing the assembly of Bruce's army. What emerges from careful cross-referencing of surviving sources is a picture of parallel preparations occurring simultaneously across Scotland. In the eastern lowlands, Bruce moved openly, assembling his core forces of veteran warriors who had fought with him for years. These movements were documented, predictable, and observed by English spies who reported regularly to Edward II. But in the Western Highlands, something else was happening in shadows deep enough that it escaped systematic recording. The first datable reference appears in a letter from an Irish chieftain to contacts in the Western Scottish Isles, preserved in Dublin archives and dated to November 1313. The letter mentions the gathering of the clans at the request of the king who wears the crown of thorns, an apparent reference to Bruce's excommunication. The Irish writer requests information about whether the foreign swords will join the mountain men, and notes that ships have been seen making harbor in places where no trade occurs. The letter's recipient is not named, but specialists have identified the destination as the MacDonald territories in the Isles. A fragmentary chronicle from a monastery in Argyll, portions of which survived the Reformation's destruction of Catholic archives, describes an event in December 1313. The text refers to chiefs gathering at the place of the black stones where the old ones met in times before memory, a description that has never been definitively located, but which some researchers believe refers to ancient standing stones in the Western Highlands. According to this account, the meeting lasted 3 days and involved representatives of clans that had been at feud for the span of 5 generations. The chronicle notes that oaths were sworn not to the king alone, but to Scotland itself, and to freedom from the English yoke that would press upon all necks alike regardless of clan or territory. Financial records from Aberdeen, one of Scotland's major ports, show unusual activity in early 1314. Ships arriving from ports in France and the Low Countries unloaded cargoes that were not properly assessed for customs, suggesting either corruption among port officials or deliberate concealment of sensitive materials. One partially preserved manifest lists iron goods and provisions for warriors, but provides no detail about the ultimate destination. The timing coincides with reports from English border officials noting increased traffic through mountain passes leading from the eastern coast toward the Central Highlands. The most revealing evidence comes from an unexpected source: weather records maintained by monasteries for agricultural purposes. Multiple religious houses across Scotland noted unusually heavy movement through their territories in late winter and early spring of 1314, documented not directly, but through observations about disrupted travel conditions and depleted food supplies in regions that should have been sparsely populated during those seasons. One monk at an abbey near Stirling noted in March 1314 that the roads bear the marks of many horses and men, more than would be expected for the season, moving northward from the coasts and westward from the mountains, all converging as rivers flow to the sea. Archaeological analysis has provided timeline markers that documents cannot. Excavations at multiple sites along the routes between Highland territories and Stirling have revealed layers of ash and debris from temporary encampments, carbon dated to the spring of 1314. The size and organization of these camps suggest military discipline rather than the casual arrangements typical of clan raiding parties. Artifacts recovered include fragments of weapons, horse equipment, and cooking implements in quantities suggesting forces numbering in the hundreds moving through terrain that official records claimed was essentially uninhabited during this period. The question of how such large-scale movements could have been coordinated without leaving more substantial documentary evidence has puzzled researchers. The answer appears to lie in a deliberate strategy of compartmentalization. Different clan contingents moved along separate routes at staggered intervals, converging only at predetermined assembly points that were themselves chosen for their remoteness and defensibility. Messages between Bruce's command and the clan chiefs appear to have been transmitted verbally by trusted messengers, rather than written documents that could be intercepted. The few written communications that did exist used cipher systems that even when discovered are only partially comprehensible 7 centuries later. The role of religious institutions in facilitating this coordination cannot be ignored. Scotland's monasteries and abbeys, while officially part of the church that had excommunicated Bruce, were staffed largely by Scots who shared their countrymen's desire for independence from English domination. These institutions provided neutral ground where representatives of feuding clans could meet, offered secure locations for storing supplies, and maintained communication networks that extended across Scotland and into Ireland and continental Europe. Several abbeys had documented connections to the Knights Templar before the order's dissolution, having served as repositories for Templar donations and administrative centers for Templar properties. The presence of foreign fighters, the mysterious external brothers mentioned in encoded documents, adds another layer to the timeline reconstruction. If fugitive Templar knights did indeed reach Scotland, they would have arrived via western ports sometime between late 1307 and early 1314. The most likely window is 1312-1313, after the order's official dissolution, but before the English could have established effective surveillance of Scottish coastal waters. Ships capable of carrying substantial numbers of armed men and their equipment would have required secure harbors, friendly local populations, and coordination with Scottish authorities who could ensure their safety from English patrols. Reconstructing their integration into Bruce's forces presents challenges. These would have been men accustomed to continental warfare, trained in cavalry tactics developed during the Crusades, speaking French or Latin rather than Gaelic or Scots English. Their presence would have been obvious to any observer, yet they do not appear in chronicles until the moment of battle. This suggests they were deliberately kept separate from the main Scottish forces during the assembly period, perhaps housed in remote locations under the protection of sympathetic clans who could claim ignorance if questioned by English agents. The timeline that emerges from this reconstruction shows a campaign of remarkable sophistication. Starting no later than November 1313, Bruce's agents began coordinating clan movements through a combination of personal diplomacy, strategic incentives, and appeals to Scottish identity. Foreign fighters arrived through western ports and were integrated into reserve forces whose existence was known only to Bruce's inner circle. Supplies were pre-positioned along routes towards Stirling using monastic networks and clan resources. All of this occurred while English observers, focused on Bruce's visible preparations in the lowlands, remained largely unaware of the scale of forces being assembled in Scotland's remote territories. By June 1314, when the English army marched north to relieve Stirling Castle, they were advancing toward an opponent far more formidable than intelligence reports had suggested, and one whose true composition would reveal itself only at the moment of maximum strategic impact. The systematic nature of the documentary gaps surrounding the Bannockburn campaign becomes most apparent when examining what should have existed, but does not. Medieval warfare, particularly campaigns involving royal armies and major fortifications, generated extensive paper trails. Muster rolls documented who served and for how long. Supply requisitions tracked provisions, weapons, and equipment. Diplomatic correspondence recorded negotiations and intelligence gathering. Battle chronicles written by participants or informed observers preserved tactical details for posterity. For most major medieval battles, historians possess multiple overlapping sources that, despite inevitable biases and inaccuracies, provide a reasonably complete picture of events. For Bannockburn, the documentary landscape is strikingly different. Scottish muster rolls from 1314 are essentially non-existent. The records that would have listed which clans contributed how many warriors, where they assembled, and under whose command they served, have not survived. English intelligence reports, normally voluminous when tracking Scottish military movements, show suspicious lacuna for the 6 months preceding the battle. The few chronicles that do describe Bannockburn were written decades after the event by authors who were not eyewitnesses and who relied on sources they do not identify. The most comprehensive contemporary account of the battle comes from the Vita Edwardi Secundi, an English chronicle written by an anonymous author sometime in the 1320s. This source provides valuable tactical details about the English army's composition and movement, but becomes frustratingly vague when describing the Scottish forces. The chronicler notes that Bruce's army was outnumbered but determined, and fought with discipline that exceeded expectation, but provides no detail about unit composition, command structure, or the origin of the troops. Most tellingly, the chronicle describes a pivotal moment in the battle when fresh forces appeared from the Scottish right flank, whose arrival threw the English cavalry into disorder, but offers no explanation of who these forces were or where they had come from. Scottish chronicles present even more troubling gaps. John Barbour's epic poem The Bruce, written in the 1370s and long considered the primary Scottish source for the Wars of Independence, dedicates extensive passages to Bruce's character and leadership, but provides surprisingly little concrete detail about the Bannockburn campaign. Barbour describes the battle in dramatic terms but identifies few participants by name beyond Bruce himself and his closest commanders. The clan contingents that would have formed the bulk of the army are mentioned only in the most general terms, with no specifics about their chiefs, their numbers, or their deployment. For a work that seeks to celebrate Scottish nationalism, this lack of detail about the clans who made victory possible is deeply puzzling, unless Barbour was deliberately avoiding information that remained sensitive even 60 years after the battle. Documentary gaps extend beyond battle accounts to administrative records. The Scottish Exchequer rolls, which documented royal revenues and expenditures, show irregular entries for 1313 to 1314. Properties in the Western Highlands that should have been generating rents and taxes show no recorded income. yet there is no indication these properties were abandoned or unproductive. Later records confirm these same estates were flourishing within a few years of Bannockburn, suggesting the gap reflects either lost documents or deliberate non-recording of transactions connected to military preparations. Perhaps most suspicious are the gaps in ecclesiastical records. The Catholic Church maintained extensive documentation of its interactions with political authorities, particularly regarding matters of excommunication and reconciliation. Bruce's excommunication by Pope Clement V in 1306 should have generated ongoing correspondence about potential reconciliation, reports from Scottish bishops about the state of the kingdom's spiritual health, and responses to Bruce's continued exercise of royal authority, despite his condemned status. Yet Scottish episcopal records from 1306 to 1314 are remarkably sparse. Letters that should exist do not. Reports that would have been routine are absent. The archives show signs of selective editing, with pages removed from bound volumes and entire sections of registers unaccounted for. Modern forensic analysis of surviving medieval manuscripts has revealed evidence of systematic alteration. Specialists in paleography and document conservation have examined Scottish archives from the 14th century, using techniques including infrared photography, ultraviolet illumination, and spectroscopic analysis of inks. These examinations have uncovered disturbing patterns. Numerous documents show signs of selective erasure, with specific names or passages chemically removed or physically scraped from parchment. In some cases, the erased text has been replaced with innocuous content, while in others the deletion was left as a visible gap. The selective nature of these alterations, targeting specific information while leaving surrounding text intact, indicates intentional censorship rather than accidental damage or age-related deterioration. Particularly significant are alterations to clan genealogies and property records. Multiple documents that trace the lineage and landholdings of specific Highland clans show evidence of post hoc modification. Names have been added or removed from family trees. Land transactions that should appear in sequence with other records are missing, or have been moved to different dates. The pattern suggests systematic effort to obscure the relationships and resources of clans active during the independence wars, making it difficult for later historians to trace precisely who controlled what territory and when. English records present their own mysteries. Edward II's administrative correspondence, normally extensive and well-preserved, shows gaps in intelligence reports from Scotland for late 1313 and early 1314. The English maintained a network of spies and informants in Scotland, and their reports were usually detailed and frequent. Yet for the crucial months when Bruce was assembling his forces, the intelligence reaching Edward's court becomes sparse and contradictory. Some reports mention only small Scottish forces preparing near Stirling. Others note unusual activity in the Highlands but provide no specifics. None mention the scale of the army that would actually confront the English at Bannockburn. This intelligence failure might be attributed to Scottish counterintelligence operations, but the pattern suggests something more systematic. Documents that should exist in English archives, reports from specific agents, correspondence with Scottish collaborators, assessments of Scottish military capability, are simply not present. In some cases, archive catalogs list documents that can no longer be found, suggesting loss or removal sometime after the initial archiving. The timing of these losses, when they can be determined, often corresponds to periods of diplomatic negotiation between Scotland and England, suggesting material was suppressed to facilitate treaties by removing evidence of previous intelligence operations or embarrassing revelations. The gaps extend to material evidence as well. Archaeological surveys have revealed the locations of major military encampments from the Wars of Independence, but sites associated with the immediate pre-Bannockburn period show signs of deliberate disturbance. Earth has been moved, artifacts scattered, structural remains deliberately demolished. This destruction appears to have occurred not in the medieval period itself, but in subsequent centuries, suggesting efforts to eliminate physical evidence that might confirm or clarify events that documentary sources had already obscured. Most troubling is what the gaps collectively suggest about historical memory. The systematic nature of the documentary and archaeological erasures indicates that multiple parties, over an extended period, worked to obscure specific aspects of how Bruce achieved victory at Bannockburn. This was not casual loss through time and accident. but deliberate suppression of information that someone considered dangerous or inconvenient. The question is why information about a Scottish victory, something that should have been celebrated and memorialized, would need to be hidden. The answer likely lies in the composition of Bruce's forces and the alliances that made victory possible, alliances that remained politically sensitive long after the immediate danger of English conquest had passed. When researchers compare accounts of Bannockburn across different regions and time periods, a striking pattern emerges. The story is told differently depending on who is telling it, when they are telling it, and what political interests they represent. These divergent narratives, when mapped geographically and chronologically, reveal not merely different perspectives on the same events, but carefully constructed versions of history designed to serve specific purposes while obscuring information others wish to conceal. The Scottish Lowland tradition, represented primarily by sources associated with the Scottish royal court and lowland nobility, presents Bannockburn as a triumph of Scottish national unity under Bruce's inspired leadership. This version emphasizes Bruce's tactical genius, the courage of named lowland commanders like James Douglas and Thomas Randolph, and the righteousness of the Scottish cause. Highland clan participation is acknowledged in general terms but rarely detailed. The clans are presented as supporting players rather than essential components of the victory. This version predominated in official chronicles and was the one taught as accepted history for centuries. The Highland oral tradition tells a different story. Passed down through generations of clan bards and storytellers, these accounts place Highland warriors at the center of the battle. Clan genealogies compiled in the 16th and 17th centuries based on oral traditions describe specific chiefs and their warriors performing decisive actions at Bannockburn. The MacDonald tradition, for instance, claims their clan held the honored right wing of the Scottish line and that their charge broke the English cavalry. The Campbell tradition describes their warriors holding critical defensive positions. The Grant and Sutherland traditions each claim their clans provided the fresh forces that appeared at the crucial moment. These competing claims cannot all be literally true, yet collectively they suggest a much larger Highland presence than lowland sources acknowledge. Continental European sources provide yet another perspective. French chronicles from the 14th century, written by observers with no direct stake in Scottish-English conflicts, describe Bannockburn as a battle where warriors who had fled from persecution in France fought alongside Scottish forces against the English. These references are tantalizing but frustratingly vague, never specifying who these warriors were or how they came to be in Scotland. A German chronicle from approximately 1325 mentions knights in white who appeared in Scotland and were never seen again, a description that could refer to Templar refugees or could be romantic invention. The most divergent accounts come from sources connected to religious institutions. Catholic Church records from the period immediately following Bannockburn are nearly silent about the battle, despite its enormous political significance. This silence is remarkable given the Church's usual practice of documenting major events, particularly those involving excommunicated rulers like Bruce. When the battle is mentioned at all in ecclesiastical sources, it is described with careful neutrality, avoiding any suggestion that divine favor had blessed Bruce's cause despite his excommunication. This contrasts sharply with the treatment of battles where Catholic monarchs prevailed, which were typically celebrated as manifestations of God's will. However, records from Scottish monasteries preserved in private collections tell a more nuanced story. A chronicle fragment from an abbey in Perthshire, discovered in the 19th century and since lost, described the Battle of Bannockburn as occurring under special providence that allowed even those condemned by Rome to fight for righteous freedom. The fragment mentioned that prayers were said for warriors from distant lands who had come seeking sanctuary and found redemption in Scotland's cause. The language suggests knowledge of non-Scottish fighters whose presence was spiritually irregular but politically necessary. Irish sources provide an unexpected angle. Medieval Irish annals, which typically focused on events in Ireland, noted the Battle of Bannockburn with unusual detail for a foreign conflict. The Annals of Connaught record that men of Ireland fought at Bannockburn alongside the Scots, referring to the Galloglass, Norse Gaelic mercenaries who served Scottish clans. But another Irish source, a genealogical text from Ulster, mentions knights who fled the persecution in France, finding welcome in Scotland and fighting alongside the island warriors against the English tyranny. The connection between Irish sources and events in Scotland becomes clearer when considering the extensive maritime networks linking the Western Scottish Isles, Ulster, and Gaelic territories in Ireland. Networks that operated largely outside English or official Scottish royal oversight. Temporal mapping reveals how the narrative shifted over time. Sources written within a few decades of 1314 are notably cautious about details regarding the composition of Bruce's forces. As the 14th century progressed and memories of the actual participants faded, accounts became either more generic or more embellished with legendary elements. By the 15th century, Bannockburn had been transformed in both Scottish and English traditions into a symbolic event whose actual details mattered less than its mythological significance. Scottish sources used it to celebrate national identity. English sources used it to explain the folly of Edward II's weak leadership. The Renaissance period brought renewed interest in the battle, but also systematic rewriting of its history. Reformation-era Scottish historians, writing in the 16th century during and after the break with Rome, were particularly careful to downplay any suggestion of irregular religious arrangements during Bruce's reign. Sources that might have hinted at cooperation between excommunicated Scottish leaders and fugitive Catholic religious orders were either suppressed or reinterpreted to remove potentially embarrassing connections. Meanwhile, Catholic historians on the continent preserved or invented traditions connecting the Templars to Scotland in ways that served their own theological and political purposes. By the 18th century, Enlightenment historians were attempting to strip away legendary accretions and reconstruct what actually happened at Bannockburn. Their methods, however, were limited to analyzing the very sources that had been systematically edited or selectively preserved. These historians confidently dismissed Highland oral traditions as unreliable, questioned continental references to foreign warriors as romantic embellishment, and accepted the sparse official records as broadly accurate despite their gaps. The result was a historiography that rationalized away the mysteries by declaring them fabrications, a methodological choice that eliminated the evidence of irregularities by defining such evidence as inherently suspect. Modern comparative analysis reveals that each tradition preserves elements missing from the others. Lowland sources provide political and administrative context, but minimize clan contributions. Highland traditions preserve clan participation, but conflate different events and exaggerate individual clan importance. Continental sources note foreign warrior presence but lack specifics. Religious sources hint at spiritual irregularities but avoid explicit details. The true picture emerges only by mapping these divergent accounts against each other, identifying where they contradict, where they complement, and where they conspicuously avoid addressing the same topics. What becomes clear from this comparative mapping is that no single tradition tells the complete story because each was crafted to serve specific audiences while protecting specific secrets. The fact that different sources systematically avoid the same topics, the precise composition of Highland forces, the identity of the reserve cavalry, the religious status of certain warriors, suggests coordinated suppression of information that multiple parties, for different reasons, wish to keep obscure. The divergent histories are not merely different interpretations of events, but pieces of a puzzle deliberately scattered to prevent anyone from seeing the complete image. The systematic concealment of information about Bannockburn cannot be explained by ordinary historical factors such as lost documents or biased chroniclers. The pattern of suppression is too consistent, too widespread, and too clearly targeted at specific types of information to be accidental. What emerges from careful analysis is evidence of a conspiracy, not a conspiracy to commit wrong, but a conspiracy of silence designed to protect dangerous knowledge about alliances that violated religious, political, and social norms of medieval Europe. The first axis of conspiracy involved the Knights Templar. By 1314, the order had been formally dissolved by Pope Clement V under pressure from King Philip IV of France. The official narrative held that the Templars had been destroyed because of heresy and moral corruption. The confessions extracted under torture, the public executions, and the papal bulls of dissolution were meant to demonstrate that no trace of the order remained. Yet persistent reports suggested otherwise. Ships had escaped from La Rochelle. Knights had disappeared into regions beyond effective royal and papal control. Resources estimated in millions of livres had never been recovered. If fugitive Templars had reached Scotland and fought at Bannockburn, This fact would have been profoundly embarrassing to multiple parties. For the Catholic Church, it would demonstrate that excommunicated heretics had found sanctuary and had been used by another excommunicated monarch to achieve military victory. For the French crown, it would suggest that Philip's supposedly comprehensive destruction of the order had been incomplete. For future Scottish kings seeking reconciliation with Rome, it would represent a skeleton in the political closet better left buried. Most dangerously, the survival and effective deployment of Templar military capabilities would suggest that the order's dissolution had been motivated by politics and greed, rather than genuine religious concerns, a revelation that could undermine the entire justification for their destruction. The evidence of Templar involvement at Bannockburn, while circumstantial, is substantial enough to have justified systematic suppression. The mysterious cavalry force that appeared at the critical moment and whose origin no chronicle adequately explains. The burial sites containing warriors whose equipment and physical characteristics suggest continental European origin and cavalry training. The persistent oral traditions in Western Scotland about white knights and foreign warriors. The documented connections between Bruce's closest allies, particularly the Sinclair family, and former Templar properties and networks. Each piece of evidence, individually dismissed as inconclusive, collectively suggests a presence that contemporary authorities had strong motivation to obscure. The second axis of conspiracy involved the Highland clans themselves. The unification of traditionally feuding clans under Bruce's leadership was politically necessary for Scottish independence, but socially revolutionary in its implications. For centuries, Highland society had operated according to principles that the Scottish lowland elite and the English found barbaric and threatening. Clan loyalty superseded feudal obligation. Chiefs commanded allegiance based on kinship and personal reputation, rather than formal grants of authority from kings. The Gaelic language and culture maintained connections to Ireland and the Western Isles that transcended the borders Scottish and English kings tried to impose. When Highland chiefs agreed to coordinate their forces for Bannockburn, they were not merely supporting Bruce. They were demonstrating a capacity for organized military action independent of lowland political structures. This capacity was threatening to everyone who depended on keeping Highland power fragmented. Future Scottish kings would spend centuries trying to subjugate the clans. English monarchs viewed Highland military potential as a permanent threat to their northern border. Both sides had strong motivation to downplay evidence that clans could effectively unite when circumstances demanded. The oral traditions preserved in Highland communities tell of a gathering where chiefs swore oaths to Scotland itself, rather than to any king, a distinction that suggested a nationalist consciousness independent of feudal structures. These traditions describe coordination mechanisms that operated through personal relationships, trusted messengers, and sacred oaths, witnessed at ancient standing stones rather than through formal contracts and royal commands. This alternative system of military organization, if fully documented and acknowledged, would have provided a template for future Highland resistance to centralized authority, exactly what both Scottish and English crowns wished to prevent. The third axis of conspiracy involved religious irregularities that troubled the Catholic Church. Bruce's excommunication created a theological problem. How could God favor an excommunicated king? The traditional answer was that God didn't, that Bruce's ultimate success came despite rather than because of divine favor, and that his reconciliation with the Church, which occurred years after Bannockburn, restored proper order. But if the battle had involved cooperation between Bruce and fugitive Templars, both excommunicated, both condemned by Rome, then the narrative became dangerously complicated. Worse still if the Highland clans had maintained pre-Christian religious practices alongside Catholic orthodoxy, as some evidence suggests. Medieval sources occasionally reference pagan customs in the Highlands without elaboration, perhaps because explicit description would be too disturbing. If clan warriors had invoked ancient gods alongside Christian prayers before battle, if chiefs had performed rituals at standing stones that predated Christianity, then Bannockburn represented not merely a military victory, but a successful blending of spiritual traditions that the Church had spent centuries trying to eradicate. The evidence for such religious complexity appears in fragmentary form across multiple sources. A monk's marginal note in a Scottish psalter from the mid-14th century mentions warriors who prayed to stones as well as crosses. An Irish chronicle describes Highland chiefs performing ceremonies in the manner of their ancestors before the faith came to the Isles. Archaeological surveys of sites associated with clan gatherings have revealed Christian chapels built adjacent to or incorporating megalithic monuments, suggesting deliberate architectural acknowledgement of spiritual continuity between pagan and Christian traditions. These practices, if fully documented, would have undermined the Church's claim to exclusive religious authority. The conspiracy of silence that emerges from these overlapping motivations explains why information about Bannockburn was systematically suppressed by multiple parties who otherwise opposed each other. The Church wanted to obscure evidence of excommunicated warriors achieving victory and irregular religious practices. The French wanted to hide evidence of Templar survival. Future Scottish kings wanted to downplay Highland military independence and religious heterodoxy. English monarchs wanted to minimize the significance of their defeat and avoid acknowledging the sophistication of Scottish military capabilities. Each party had reasons to suppress different aspects of the truth, but collectively their efforts created the documentary vacuum that surrounds the battle. Modern research has begun to penetrate this conspiracy of silence, but significant obstacles remain. The Vatican archives, while more accessible than in previous centuries, still restrict access to certain categories of documents. Researchers report that materials related to excommunications, reconciliations, and irregular religious practices in medieval Scotland remain classified or require special permissions difficult to obtain. Scottish National Archives contain collection catalogues listing documents that can no longer be found, suggesting either loss or deliberate removal at some point in the past. English archives show similar gaps, particularly in intelligence materials related to Scotland in the early 14th century. Private collections present perhaps the greatest challenge. Many medieval documents pass through centuries of inheritance in noble families before being donated to or acquired by institutions. During those centuries, families had opportunities to destroy, hide, or alter documents that reflected poorly on their ancestors or revealed information they preferred to keep secret. Some of the most tantalizing fragments related to Bannockburn have come from private collections, often discovered accidentally during estate sales or building renovations, suggesting that additional evidence may still exist in unknown locations. The forbidden knowledge at the heart of the Bannockburn conspiracy is not a single revelation, but a complex web of irregular alliances, religious heterodoxy, and alternative power structures that challenged medieval orthodoxies. It reveals that the neat categories by which historians organize medieval society, Catholic and heretic, lowland and highland, feudal obligation and clan loyalty, were far more permeable than official sources admitted. It demonstrates that excommunicated leaders and dissolved religious orders could still command loyalty and achieve victories. Most dangerously, it suggests that ordinary people and their leaders could coordinate effective action outside and even against the structures of church and crown, a revelation that every established power had strong motivation to suppress. The knowledge of what truly occurred at Bannockburn did not disappear with the medieval participants. Instead, it transformed, fragmenting into discrete pieces carried forward by different groups for different purposes, preserved in forms that would not immediately reveal their significance to outsiders. This process of conscious transmission through generations created a network of esoteric knowledge that connected families, organizations, and traditions across centuries, while maintaining sufficient obscurity to avoid suppression by authorities who would have objected to its content. The Highland clans developed their own methods of preserving dangerous memories. The position of clan bard or seanchaid carried responsibility for maintaining oral genealogies and histories that stretched back generations. These recitations, performed at gatherings and passed from master to apprentice, served practical purposes, establishing land claims, resolving disputes about precedence, and reinforcing clan identity. But embedded within the conventional genealogies were coded references to events and alliances that could not be spoken of openly. A seanchaid from Clan Donald, recorded in the 16th century, includes a passage about the gathering at Stirling, when the chief stood as one and the white warriors came from across the water. The passage uses archaic Gaelic vocabulary and metaphorical language that would have been opaque to outsiders, but clear to those initiated into clan traditions. Similar references appear in bardic poetry from other Highland clans, each preserving fragments of memory about the coordination that made Bannockburn possible, while avoiding explicit details that might have attracted unwanted attention. The transformation of these oral traditions into written form during the 16th and 17th centuries occurred during a period when Highland culture was under threat from both Scottish lowland authorities and English military pressure. Clan chiefs, recognizing that oral transmission alone might not survive the destruction of traditional Highland society, commissioned manuscripts preserving genealogies, histories, and territorial claims. These documents, many now housed in archives or private collections, contain layers of meaning. Surface readings provide conventional clan histories acceptable to authorities. Deeper readings, requiring knowledge of coded language and historical context, reveal information about irregular alliances and spiritual practices that official sources suppressed. The Sinclair family, whose estates at Rosslyn in Midlothian had connections to both the Templars and Bruce's inner circle, developed architectural means of preserving knowledge. Rosslyn Chapel, constructed in the mid-15th century, more than a century after Bannockburn, contains elaborate stone carvings that have puzzled researchers for generations. The symbolism combines Christian iconography with elements drawn from non-Christian traditions, astronomical references, and geometric patterns that some specialists interpret as encoding mathematical and possibly cartographic information. Most controversially, certain carvings appear to depict plants native to the Americas, maize and aloe, rendered with botanical accuracy decades before Columbus's voyages. If authentic, these carvings suggest knowledge of transatlantic geography that should not have existed in 15th century Scotland. Some researchers have proposed that the Sinclair family possessed maps or information derived from Templar sources, possibly including evidence of pre-Columbian voyages. The connection to Bannockburn lies in the suggestion that fugitive Templars brought not merely military skills, but also geographical and navigational knowledge that was subsequently encoded in architecture, where it would survive, even if written records were destroyed. The emergence of Freemasonry in Scotland during the 17th century created another vector for transmitting esoteric traditions. The earliest documented Masonic lodges appeared in Scotland well before the establishment of the Grand Lodge system in England, suggesting indigenous development rather than importation of English practices. These Scottish lodges incorporated rituals and symbolism that explicitly referenced medieval warrior brotherhoods, temple-building traditions, and geometric knowledge. Several Scottish Masonic rites developed degrees specifically referencing the Knights Templar, claiming that Freemasonry preserved traditions passed down from the medieval order after its dissolution. While mainstream historians have questioned whether direct institutional continuity existed between Templars and Freemasons, the symbolic connections were clearly intentional. Masonic rituals performed in Scotland incorporated narratives about warrior monks fleeing persecution, about secret knowledge preserved through symbolic architecture, and about alliances that transcended conventional religious and political boundaries, themes that resonated with actual historical events even if the specific connections could not be definitively proven. The geographic distribution of Masonic lodges in Scotland shows interesting patterns. Lodges appeared earliest and most densely in regions associated with both Templar properties and clan territories involved in the Wars of Independence. The lodge at Kilwinning in Ayrshire, which claims to be among the oldest in Scotland, was established in a town that had medieval connections to both the Templars and to maritime networks linking Scotland, Ireland, and continental Europe. The concentration of Masonic activity in Western Scotland, particularly in areas associated with the MacDonald and Campbell clans, suggests transmission of esoteric traditions through family networks that preserved memory of the alliances formed for Bannockburn. Maritime traditions carried knowledge across waters. The Western Scottish Isles maintained connections to Ireland, the Hebrides, and beyond, that operated largely outside the oversight of Scottish or English royal authorities. Sea routes that had served Norse raiders in earlier centuries became highways for people, goods, and information that kingdoms on land could not easily monitor or control. Ship captains and merchants operating these routes developed their own traditions and knowledge systems, including navigational techniques that drew on pre-Christian star lore alongside Christian practices. Several maritime families in Western Scotland preserved traditions about the ships that came bearing warriors in white during the Wars of Independence. These traditions recorded in family chronicles during the 17th and 18th centuries, described vessels arriving at remote harbors in the Western Isles, unloading armed men who spoke foreign languages, and subsequently disappearing into the interior. The families who facilitated these arrivals, providing harbor facilities, provisions, and local knowledge, maintained memory of their role in events that official histories ignored. The development of trade routes connecting Scotland to continental Europe, particularly to France, the Low Countries, and the Baltic, created networks through which information traveled alongside commercial goods. Scottish merchant families operating in European ports maintained relationships with continental religious houses, merchant guilds, and noble families. These relationships, often spanning generations, facilitated the quiet movement of people and knowledge between Scotland and the continent. Researchers examining records of Scottish trading families have discovered correspondence referring obliquely to matters known in Scotland and debts of honor that suggest awareness of historical obligations connecting Scottish and continental interests. Academic transmission occurred through university networks. Scottish scholars attending universities in Paris, Bologna, and other continental centers encountered traditions and knowledge systems not available in British Isles. Some of these scholars maintained connections to Highland families through clan patronage systems. When they returned to Scotland, they brought not merely academic learning, but awareness of esoteric traditions preserved in continental institutions. The development of Scottish universities, particularly St. Andrews, Glasgow, and Aberdeen, created institutional settings where dangerous knowledge could be preserved in library collections, discussed in protected academic contexts, and transmitted to subsequent generations of scholars who understood its significance. The thread connecting all these transmission methods is deliberate compartmentalization. No single tradition preserved the complete story. Highland clans maintained oral memories of military coordination, but not necessarily the full details of foreign warrior involvement. The Sinclair family encoded geographical and architectural knowledge, but not necessarily complete information about clan alliances. Masonic lodges preserved symbolic traditions about warrior brotherhoods, but not detailed historical records of specific events. Maritime families remembered harboring fugitive warriors, but not necessarily what those warriors did afterward. Academic networks preserved fragments of esoteric knowledge, but often without clear understanding of how those fragments connected to Scottish history. This compartmentalization served protective purposes. If authorities suppressed one tradition, others survived. If one family line died out, others carried forward different pieces of the puzzle. The fragmentation ensured that reconstructing the complete picture required synthesizing information from multiple sources, a task that would have been difficult or impossible for medieval authorities trying to suppress dangerous knowledge, but which modern researchers with access to diverse archives and analytical techniques might finally accomplish. The secret spread through time not as a single narrative but as a web of interconnected traditions, each preserving elements of truth while obscuring others, collectively ensuring that memory of irregular alliances and forbidden knowledge survived even as official histories tried to erase them.